Hey there, I'm Meister, and I don't know whether we've ever gotten a chance to meet, but I'm really glad to have the opportunity to sit here and talk to you today. So I've been both a coffee professional and a journalist for about 20 years now, and I do those jobs kind of simultaneously. Currently I have two roles, both with the company called Cafe Imports. My primary role is as the Director of Education, which means I use my journalistic skills to essentially investigate and research various things about coffee, and then I take whatever I've learned and turn it into resources that are accessible and hopefully relevant to coffee professionals around the world. So my other role with the company is as editorial manager, which basically means that I oversee the content that we put out, the words on our website and on our blog, our harvest reports, our Instagram captions, and any message that you might get from us on Instagram, captions for our YouTube videos, and probably most importantly, the coffee traceability profiles for every coffee that Cafe Imports sells. That means when you're buying a coffee from us or when you're looking up more information about a coffee from us and you find things like the farm details, the elevation, the varieties, the story of the farm, maybe the details about the processing, I'm responsible for all of that. All of this is to basically say that I spend my entire days thinking about coffee, and I spend a good deal of my time thinking about how to write about and describe coffee. One of the things that I've learned over the course of my career as a professional communicator and writer is that language is really powerful, and it not only has the ability to influence what we believe, but it also fundamentally has the ability to influence how we behave. So for this session today, what I want to do is look at some of the examples of things that I have written or said in the past and offer some reflections on why I've let my thinking evolve about the ways that I describe coffee or the ways that I approach writing about coffee. I'm interested these days in also changing my behavior. It's important for me to think about the impact that my language has. And in thinking more critically about the significance of language, especially in marketing, I've really come to consider that I've been doing it wrong. And I want to show some examples from my own personal experience to hopefully start a conversation about the language that we have used in the past and maybe find a way to evolve the way that we describe coffee so that we can push the industry forward towards something more equitable, more sustainable, and overall more ethical. So first of all, I realize that it seems super obvious to say that language is important, but I do want us to unpack that idea a little bit, and it's easiest for us to use coffee as an example because it's what I know that we have in common. So let's first think about the ways that we use language to set expectations. This is a really obvious example in the coffee industry. When you pick up a bag of beans, you're probably going to read tasting notes on the side of that bag. Those tasting notes set an expectation for you. First of all, they'll probably tell you whether or not you can expect to like the coffee inside. If there are words described on that bag that you know that you don't prefer, you'll probably put the bag down and buy another one. We all know that if you read flavor notes on a bag, 9 times out of 10, you're going to go home and try and find those flavor notes in the cup, right? But you might also convince yourself that you found them when you haven't. So that's one direct example. Another example of the impact of language is that it sets a tone for our businesses and for our industry as a whole. Think about the number of specialty coffee companies whose mission statements you've read that say something like, "We value sustainability, service, and quality." Those words, sustainability, service, quality, they get repeated so many times by like-minded companies in the industry that they're values that we've actually come to associate with specialty coffee in general. And finally, of course, our language has impact over other people's behavior, which is why marketing exists. We describe coffee in the hopes that someone will come and buy it. It also has the power to create trends and to influence companies to follow suit. The trends that we create because we see that customers respond to certain types of language and certain types of products that are described with certain types of language has impact over our behavior as well as an industry. It'll impact what we buy, how we buy it, how we sell it, and who we sell it to. So in order to examine all of these different areas of why I think language is important, I want us to get into the Wayback Machine together. We're actually not going to go that long ago, but we are going to look into my own personal archives as a writer and see if we can pull out some examples of places where, thankfully, I feel like my language has really evolved. And I want to give you some insight into why I've tried to actively change the use of certain words and certain terms in order to really push myself to push others to make the industry slightly more equitable. So the first of these examples that I want to read for you is from my writing about the history of coffee, and specifically the history of how coffee arrived in coffee-growing countries. So let me read you a direct quote. So here's something that I wrote in a page about the history of coffee in El Salvador. Coffee was planted and cultivated here mostly for domestic consumption, starting in the mid-1700s. So let's unpack that sentence just a little bit before we move on to the next example. Coffee was planted and cultivated here, but I don't say by whom, and I don't say under what circumstances. Now let's explore the second half of that sentence. Mostly for domestic consumption. Whose domestic consumption? In El Salvador, in the mid-1700s? Who do I think I'm writing about? Let's move on to the next example to see if we can get a little bit more explicit. This one is about the history of coffee in Guatemala. Coffee came to Guatemala in the late 18th century, as it did to many other Central and South American countries. Coffee came to Guatemala makes it sound a little bit like coffee just blew in on a breeze and spontaneously sprouted out of a field somehow. What is it that I'm avoiding saying? What I'm avoiding saying is that coffee didn't blow in on a breeze, it rode in on a wave of really brutal colonization. In many cases, it came as a forced crop that created slavery conditions for millions of native people while making white settlers rich. Now, I can understand not wanting to sell colonialism in a coffee cup, but what is the impact of my not being explicit about saying where coffee actually came from? I think that my avoidance of these terms actually has a really significant impact over the ways that we look at coffee today. I don't know how much you know about the actually quite violent colonial history of coffee around the world, but the conditions that coffee growers exist in today are directly related to a lot of that colonial history. By not mentioning that in these descriptions of where coffee comes from, I'm allowing us to ignore the fact that this is an ancient history and it still is affecting contemporary history. The colonial history of coffee can be quite bleak, but I do think that it's our responsibility as people who work in this industry today, as we explore the myriad complicated issues that are facing coffee growers specifically, it's our responsibility to know it, to learn it, to live with it, and to acknowledge it whenever we can. It's not going to be easy and it's not going to be pretty, but these days I try not to whitewash where coffee came from and how it started to be grown around the world, because I think that that information is very important when we look at the way that coffee farmers are having to still fight for representation, for equity in the supply chain, for power in these relationships. I'll try and provide some resources for you if you want to learn more about the history of colonialism in coffee. There's lots of different things to read, lots of different people who are talking about it and leaving a history behind. And now is the time to really brush up on that history, because I think it's important that we start to incorporate that understanding into the descriptions that we write on our websites and on our packaging and things like that. Okay, number 2 in the list of things that I hope have evolved in my own language. The use of our farmers, as in, our farmers are dedicated and passionate about specialty coffee, or our farmers turned in a really great crop this year. What's the problem with using the word our? It immediately implies ownership for one thing, right? That a little bit calls back to the earlier point. It also implies that those farmers have some reason to feel beholden to us or grateful to us. It also implies maybe that we're in charge. Our farmers. Who's in the position of power in a phrase like that? I'll tell you the exact moment that I realized that this type of phrasing was really problematic, and it's not a great story to tell on myself, but I'll tell it anyway. I was at an event and I was talking to a peer in the industry, and they mentioned seeing another importing company that was selling coffee that was grown by a husband and wife team that my company has been buying coffee from for years. My immediate reaction was to feel jealous. Well, how could they sell to them? As soon as it came out of my mouth, I realized that I was being absurd. First of all, because I'm one of the people in the world who's saying very loudly, coffee producers need to earn more money in order to survive. Well, what if this other company had offered them more money for their coffee? What if they sold coffee that they don't usually sell to us to them? Or what if they just like someone there and they want to work with both of us? At the end of the day, it was so significant to recognize that using language like our, even though I know fundamentally and truthfully they don't belong to us, it had gotten its hooks in me somehow, so that I could feel jealous, I could feel entitled, I could feel betrayed. These days I try to use slightly more awkward but definitely more accurate terms, like the farmers whose coffee we buy, or the producers who grew the coffee we bought. Okay, so this brings us to number 3. This is one I'm still actively struggling with, so I'm actually using this video as a way to ask you to help me, because I'm gonna need some reinforcement and I'm gonna need some challenging. And that's the word partnership. Partnership is probably the most overused word in specialty coffee, maybe second only to quality. And I've probably written it 40 times today as I was just going about my day doing my job. It's so easy to say we build partnerships with farmers all around the world, or our producer partner in Guatemala did XYZ. But I really want us to stop and think about what the word partnership means and what it implies. When I started to think about it, I realized that the word partnership has something of a two-way street element built in. It implies a sense of commitment. It implies transparent communication. It implies collaboration, a plan for conflict resolution, and compromise. Right? That's what partnership implies. When we use the word partner or partnership to describe what are actually just transactional relationships, it sends the wrong message to the consumer, but it also kind of excuses us from doing the work of really evaluating what those relationships are like. Here's an example for you. If I cup a coffee that I think is great, and I say, I want to buy that, so I buy that producer's coffee once, does that make me their partner, or does it make me their customer? Now let's say I also buy their coffee the next year and the next year, but I don't have any direct communication with that farmer at all, and all the information that I have about them comes from a secondhand source. Does that make it a partnership, or am I just a regular customer? Now, if I want to take that relationship to the next level, what does that look like? Does it look like having a direct line of communication to that producer, getting to know them a little? Does it look like asking them what they need? Does it look like visiting them or sending a message? Does it look like sending their coffee back so that they can experience what I've done with it as a roaster? Does it look like having a plan in place to continue to support them when quality is down some year? Not every single coffee buying relationship is a partnership, just like not everybody I've ever dated was my partner. Knowing the difference in life and in coffee is really important, and being sure that we use the language appropriately will send the right message. So again, I'm really not great at this, and I still fall back on the word partnership, in part because I don't really know yet what to replace it with. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the ways that we romanticize and think about these relationships and the ways that we interact with coffee farmers. So I definitely want you to feel free to call me out when I'm using the word partnership in a way that doesn't seem like it is calibrated. But I also want to say that now, when I sit down to write about a relationship that we have, I ask myself a kind of checklist of questions. Is this a real partnership, or is this a more surface level business transaction? Okay, you've made it this far. We've got one more example, and it's an area of language that I'm trying really hard to extract myself from. Saviorism. When I say saviorism, I mean any language that describes the buyer in the situation as a hero or even as a helper, especially when they're working with people from marginalized or underprivileged or oppressed communities in coffee growing countries. It is really embarrassing to share with you examples of ways that I've used saviorism in my language, but I think it's important that you have something very specific to identify with that idea. So here we go. So the first one would be an example like, and this is something I've written many times, the producer was paid a premium for their high quality coffee, and they used that premium to invest in buying a new wet mill for their farm. Now, what does that tell the reader? It tells the reader that without this particular purchase, that farmer wouldn't have a new wet mill. It also implicitly tells the reader that we approve of the use of the funds toward a new wet mill. That's where it starts to get especially dangerous. When's the last time you had to justify what you used your hard-earned money for? What if this producer wanted to take their family to the beach or buy a new TV? Would that make us feel less like heroes in this story? Why do we need to be heroes in this story? And also, what gives us the right to decide whether or not a producer is making good or bad decisions with their money? It's their money. For me, this reflection is completely intertwined with the other reflections that I've shared about ownership, about power, about who gets to be the arbiter of what is appropriate for producers to do with their money or with their coffee or with their lives. I realized that in order for me to truly believe and truly embody the shift in power that I believe needs to happen in the industry, I needed to also change the way that I use language to describe those relationships. Another example is whenever I've used the words humble or proud to describe a coffee farmer. My use of a term like that reinforces the idea that the producer should be grateful, rather than maybe feeling frustrated that they don't have more, or frustrated that they don't earn more money for their coffee, or angry in general at the way that the system is designed to keep information and access away from them. There's nothing wrong with being proud. It's where the assessment is coming from that makes it kind of dangerous, just like it's dangerous for us to be the arbiters of appropriateness when it comes to the use of funds. So what can I say instead? I could always describe coffee farmers as our equals in the business of coffee. I could also focus on the more technical aspects of the production of the coffee, the elevation, the varieties, the things that I already know are more relevant to the roaster. I can avoid things that sound romantic but are actually more invasive. And of course, I could ask the producer themselves how they want to be depicted, and I can ask them to do the writing too. That only works if you actually have a partnership. Are you starting to see a theme? Anyway, it feels really vulnerable to share these examples with you, but I really hope that you're able to see some areas where I hope that our language can evolve, and I hope that this is just the start of a conversation about the evolution of the way that we describe coffee as a real tool to push the industry toward a more equitable and sustainable place. I really believe that language has the power to not only change belief, but also fundamentally to change behavior. And I would love to keep talking about this and workshopping more of the language that we think needs to evolve. Please consider me just an email away. I would love to hear your feedback. I love to be called out and challenged. I really want to learn, and I really want us all to do better as an industry, because I believe that coffee can actually be a force for good, whether or not that sounds naive. So please feel free to ping me anytime. I'm Meister at caféimports.com, and I would love to talk about language with you. Until next time, I'm wishing you good words, good deeds, and great coffee.